Our objective for the day is to cover a couple of related topics. First of all, we're going to consider the question of how other European nations got involved in the New World. So far, our story has been mostly about the Spanish and Native Americans. Today, we're going to consider how other European nations became involved in New World activities. And then we're going to begin a discussion of colonial Virginia that will continue on Friday, and then compare Virginia with the New England colonies. The answer to the first question, how did other European nations get involved in the New World, is relatively simple. They were interested in all the Spanish treasure that was coming out of Central America. The Spanish did well for themselves just in Hispaniola with gold and silver. It didn't work out so well for the Native Americans of Hispaniola, but they did even better in Central America. Once they conquered the Aztec Empire, they confiscated all of that gold and found the gold mines and began producing more gold. They conquered the Incan Empire in South America and laid hands on that gold. There were gold mines all throughout Central America and South America, and the Spanish began shipping that gold back to Spain on a yearly basis. For the next 100 years, Spain was the recipient of an unimaginable amount of wealth traveling in treasure fleets across the Atlantic Ocean. And it was that free-floating gold and silver that drew the notice of the English and the French and the Dutch. They weren't thinking necessarily about establishing colonies, but they were quite interested in all of that gold out there floating around on the high seas. So they first appeared as pirates. In the 1560s, just for fun, that's a picture of Captain Jack Sparrow from the Disney franchise, of course. His attire there is characteristic of pirates in the Caribbean and the early 1700s. So it's not quite applicable to the 1560s, but similar situation. They would have probably preferred to be called privateers as opposed to pirates, and there is a subtle difference. A pirate was simply someone sailing about, attacking ships and taking loot and all of that sort of thing for their own personal benefit. Most of these guys, the early Europeans showing up in the 1560s, considered themselves privateers rather than pirates because they had the support, in most cases, of their king or queen. A privateer is not just a loose cannon sailing about on their own recognizance. A privateer is someone oftentimes in the 1560s to 1600 who had something called a letter of marque, a piece of paper actually signed by a government official or the king or queen, endorsing them, giving them national permission to go out and attack their enemies, the ships of their enemies. So they saw themselves as doing the work of the nation state in many cases, the privateers. They had, if not a signature, they had a firm endorsement. Queen Elizabeth is a good example. She was ruling England in the 1560s all the way up to her death in 1603. She never actually signed a letter of marque, but she clearly supported privateering. And she had some favorite privateers. We'll meet one in just a moment, Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Francis Drake as well. She had a whole cluster of these guys, and they knew for sure Queen Elizabeth supported what they were doing, and when they got back to London with the treasure, they gave her a share. They were also operating within the context of the Protestant Reformation. So they would have wanted to be called privateers, but they also saw themselves, in addition to doing the work of the nation, saw themselves as doing God's work. Do you remember when the Protestant Reformation got started? One no. I know you've encountered it somewhere. So just a quick review. Martin Luther? Yeah. Martin Luther had some concerns about the Roman Catholic Church. He was Roman Catholic himself. He did not intend to fracture or splinter Christianity. He just wanted to correct some things that he thought were wrong about Catholic practices. So he nailed 95 theses or criticisms up to a church door in 1513. He just wanted to start a conversation, but that conversation resulted in Christianity separating into lots of denominations. So 1513 started the Protestant Reformation. Lutheranism, later on Methodism, Presbyterianism, Baptists, etc. England separated in 1533, and I'm sure you know that story as well. Henry VIII caught sight of a cute young thing and could not get a divorce from his wife, from the Roman Catholic Pope. So he created his own church. He separated from the Roman Catholic Church, gave himself a divorce, and married Anne Boleyn. But 1533, England left the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. So starting in 1513, Christianity began to fragment. And most of these guys, the privateers, were coming from Protestant nations, or nations that had issues with Spain. England was Protestant at this point. Queen Elizabeth, in fact, was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. So she had a lot of reasons to support Protestantism and try to keep England from going back into the Roman Catholic Church. The Netherlands were Protestant. France was still technically Roman Catholic, but it had long-standing issues with Spain. But when these guys attacked a Spanish treasure ship, they felt like they were justified on a couple of levels. One, Queen Elizabeth supported them if they were English, and secondly, they were attacking the Catholic, the evil Catholic, what they considered the evil Catholic Empire. So they were striking a blow for religious truth in their minds. But that's where they first entered the Caribbean, and they began looking around for, as they got wealthy and had some success attacking those treasure ships, looking around for places to hide their treasure, I guess, places to stash provisions and supplies. The Bahamas were a good location because of all those islands. You know what's happening in the Bahamas now? A couple of people are saying yes. They've just been hit pretty hard by a hurricane, but they were one of the premier destinations for pirates looking for little bases of operation. Sir Walter Raleigh was looking for such a base of operation, a place to establish a pirate lair in the 1580s. He had some success attacking the Spanish treasure ships, and Queen Elizabeth liked him a lot. So much so that historians speculate maybe they had more than just a queen and privateer relationship. But she gave him a grant of land in North America, Virginia. He named it Virginia after her because she was known as the Virgin Queen. She never married, never had children, so Sir Walter Raleigh named it after her. And his intention with that immense grant, he didn't need that much land. She gave it to him all the way to the Pacific Ocean, wherever that was. They didn't really know. But his intention was to establish a pirate base. All of the Spanish treasure ships floated right past Georgia and Carolina and up into southern Virginia before turning eastward across the Atlantic to make their way back to Spain. And a pirate base along the coast of North Carolina or southern Virginia would be a perfect location from which to attack those treasure fleets. So Walter Raleigh started organizing an expedition. The story is probably a little too long for us in History 111. You have on the screen 1587. What's left out of that text is an early failed attempt in 1583. He sent his colonist, Walter Raleigh, for what it's worth, never showed up himself, never went himself. He just organized it from England. But he sent about 100 colonists, privateers mostly, to Roanoke Island in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, close to the Virginia border in 1583, and they angered Native Americans and had to be evacuated by Sir Francis Drake. But then he tried again in 1587. He organized a second attempt, loaded up the colonists, and sent them back rather stupidly to the exact same island, Roanoke Island, where they had already angered Native Americans. The second group of colonists, sadly, didn't know they were walking into that kind of a situation. But 1587, they were dropped off on Roanoke Island, and the supply ship immediately took off for England to go back and get meat and supplies, axes, everything they might need for the little colony, intended again just to be a pirate base. And once that supply ship got back to England, it discovered that there was a lot going on that side of the Atlantic Ocean. Most importantly, Spain had it with all the privateering. In 1588, Spain organized a massive invasionary force, the Spanish Armada. Hundreds of ships with tens of thousands of soldiers set sail from Spain toward England with the intention of invading England, conquering England, yanking Queen Elizabeth off the throne as a supporter of Sir Walter Raleigh and privateering and a Protestant, and installing a monarch who was more friendly to the Catholic faith than Spain. Sir Walter Raleigh was appointed the job of defending England by Queen Elizabeth. He had to organize the defense of the coast, knowing that all those Spanish ships were on their way to conquer England. And even though it was his colony of Roanoke and his supply ship, he made the very wise decision that England could not spare a single ship at that moment. So the supply ship was fitted out with defensive weaponry and used to defend the British coasts. In 1588, it was not able to go back as promptly as they hoped. Bad weather and very good planning by Sir Walter Raleigh resulted in an English victory. A lot of the Spanish ships were sunk in storms, and ultimately they had to retreat, sail back down to Spain without having conquered England. Sir Walter Raleigh waited yet another year to make sure everything was safe, 1589, and finally in 1590, when things had settled down a bit, he loaded up that supply ship and sent it back to his little pirate base of Roanoke on the coast of North Carolina. Do you remember what it found? Nothing. Nothing is right. This is the famous lost colony of Roanoke. None of the colonists were present. There were no bodies, no graves, no sign of a struggle, nothing that could explain the situation. The supply ship searched the coast best as it could, but there was no sign of the colonists. Nothing but a clue carved into a tree. That one word, Croatoan. And historians have been debating ever since what it could possibly mean. Some historians claim they've solved the mystery, others say no. It very much remains an open question what happened to the lost colonists of Roanoke. The Spanish Armada is one of the most important events in early American history. It had profound consequences. The Spanish defeat opened the door to other European nations in a lot of ways. It led to a decline in Spanish power. The Spanish weren't out of the situation altogether, but starting in 1588, there was a visible and prolonged decline in power, national power for the Spanish. And other European nations used that opportunity to begin establishing colonies in the New World. You can see on this map, Spanish had all of the Caribbean and Central America, and they had established a footprint in Florida in 1565. Then 1588, Spanish Armada, and the rest of our story is either French or English or Dutch. They established no more colonies from that point up the East Coast. You've got the French coming in Louisiana, which we'll talk about later, and Canada. Even the Swedes, even Sweden established a little colony up here on the northeast of North America. But the rest of it is English from that point up. In a sense, you could say we are speaking English in this classroom today, in part because of the Spanish Armada, because it shifted the trajectory of colonization at just that moment when England was looking for places to establish colonies. And that's our next destination. Virginia, just a little bit north of where the failed colony of Roanoke was established, across the James River in Virginia. The Virginia Company of London established a little town in 1607 called Jamestown. This is an artist's reconstruction based on archaeological information of what the fort initially looked like that very first year, 1607, when they first arrived. A little bit more than 100. Most of these early colonies had that basic package of about 100, sometimes up to 120 colonists. This is what it looked like in 1607. And I've chosen my language on this slide very carefully. It's the first permanent, successful English town in North America, because Roanoke was not permanent or successful. Are you ready for the next one? John Smith was not appointed officially by the Virginia Company of London as the leader of the colony, but he emerged as kind of a natural leader. On the ship journey across the Atlantic, and once they began setting up that fort and establishing Jamestown, he enjoyed shouting at people and giving orders, and the Virginia colonists kind of needed someone like that in their early days. So he rose to the top kind of naturally and became the de facto leader of the Virginia colony. For the rest of today and Friday, and then when we talk about New England, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to organize all our information into 4 basic categories: reasons for establishing the colony, relations with Native Americans, and a couple of others to come. But my argument, my reason for doing this is, to my mind at least, and maybe I'll persuade you along the way, Virginia and the northern colonies of Massachusetts, the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, would seem to be cut from the same cloth. They're all English. They owed allegiance and loyalty to the English king, spoke English, but they developed and were established in some cases in radically different ways. They were profoundly different, especially in these categories. The first one is the reasons or motives for establishing the colony in the first place. When we get to Massachusetts, that's going to be a very long conversation. This one for Virginia is quite short, and I'll keep it short. Virginia wanted to make money. Its whole purpose was to make a profit for the Virginia Company of London. They weren't exactly sure how they were going to do that. They had a few foggy ideas that ultimately, as you'll see, did not pan out. One of them was to find the Northwest Passage. That's basically a version of what Columbus was trying to do, trying to sail directly to China. They now knew that North America, Central America, were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but their knowledge of geography was still so superficial that they were hoping that there was a way to sail directly through North America, a water route that would allow them to go straight into the Pacific and then on to China. And when they explored the Chesapeake Bay region, with all of these rivers going deep, deep into the interior of Virginia, the James River here, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, they thought to themselves, that's very promising. One of those rivers might go far enough west to actually reach the Pacific. And if that's the case, we, the Virginia Company of London, will be in possession of the world's greatest trade route. So that's one possible way they thought they would profit. There was, of course, no Northwest Passage. Many explorers lost their lives searching for one, but there never turned out to be a Northwest Passage. They were also hoping maybe they could find some gold deposits, the way the Spaniards had done. That, too, didn't work out, but it's part of the rationale. The second category is a bit more complex for Virginia. Their relationship with Native Americans. They did not know what they were walking into in 1607. Had they known that the Chesapeake was occupied by 15 to 20,000 Native Americans, they might have considered a different location. Had they known those 15 to 20,000 Native Americans were organized into one of the most powerful chiefdoms on the East Coast, they certainly, I think, would have considered a different location. But the Native Americans of the Chesapeake were. They were quite populous, and they were well organized into what's known as the Powhatan chiefdom. I've got a question up there. How is a chiefdom different from a confederacy? It may seem like an academic question, a minor difference, but when you are there on the ground living the experience, it is a meaningful difference. A confederacy is a collection of equal parts. During the Civil War, where we're going to end the course, Alabama and Mississippi could make their own decisions as part of the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy. This was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a confederacy. You see a lot of tribal names up here on the map. Mattapones, Rappahannocks. They were not equal members of this chiefdom. A chiefdom is a political organization with, logically enough, one chief ruling over it. And oftentimes there are some hereditary offices, a kind of basic bureaucracy underneath the chief. But Powhatan, the ruler and the chiefdom, were named the same thing. Powhatan was the absolute chief. He ruled over that entire region with absolute authority. It was not a democracy. It was not a confederacy. It was a chiefdom. He had the power of life and death over everyone living in his chiefdom. So even though you see Rappahannocks up there to the north, in order to stay there peacefully, they had to give Powhatan a share of their agricultural harvest. And all of these Indians, of course, were agricultural. To be a part of the Powhatan chiefdom meant giving tribute to Powhatan every year and providing military service. If one of those members of the Powhatan chiefdom failed to do that, then Powhatan would have organized his warriors and chased them out, or persuaded them through military power to think differently. Those Virginia settlers in 1607 established Jamestown on the James River. If you follow the laser pointer here, there's the James River. They established Jamestown right about here, and they did not ask Powhatan's permission. They weren't even aware at that point that they needed to ask his permission. He knew, of course, they had arrived. If you follow that river upstream, you reach Powhatan, his town. He lived on that river. He knew a little over 100 English men, women, and children had just arrived on his river in his chiefdom without his permission and begun setting up a fort. And he wasn't terribly happy about it. He sent some warriors down to observe what the English were doing. They were a curiosity, didn't want to act prematurely without full knowledge. And they came back with detailed reports about the fort and weaponry, the muskets and gunpowder, cannons, all that sort of thing. And they told Powhatan, there's one guy down there doing most of the shouting and pointing. Everybody else seems to be doing what he tells them to do and going where he points. So Powhatan decided, that's the man I want. John Smith, as chance would have it, took a little scouting party out to explore the James River and take a look at the Virginia countryside, and Powhatan's warriors swooped in and captured that scouting party. They had no interest at all in the ordinary Englishmen, so they were killed instantly. There is what is believed to be the deerskin cloak that Powhatan was wearing when he first encountered John Smith. But John Smith was kept alive on Powhatan's orders and brought to him. This is John Smith's drawing of that encounter. John Smith wrote the story of not just this one incident, but others in Virginia, in his general history of Virginia. And he told the story. This is the story. According to John Smith, he had an annoying habit when he wrote his memoirs of referring to himself in the third person. So when you hear someone say Captain Smith, that's Captain Smith saying Captain Smith, or he was brought forward. He's referring to himself. Early 1608, he was captured by Powhatan and brought into Powhatan's presence. At last, they brought him to Roanoke, where was Powhatan, their emperor. Here, more than 200 of those grim courtiers stood wondering at him as if he had been a monster, till Powhatan and his train had put themselves in their greatest braveries. Before a fire upon a seat like a bedstead, he sat covered with a great robe made of raccoon skins and all the tails hanging by. I'm going to ask you a question about this in just a moment. Not the raccoon skins, but the basic story. On either hand did sit a young wench of 16 to 18 years, and along on each side of the house 2 rows of men, and behind them as many women, with all their heads and shoulders painted red, many of their heads bedecked with the white down of birds, but every one with something, and a great chain of white beads about their necks. At his entrance before the king, all the people gave a great shout. The queen of Appomattox was appointed to bring him water to wash his hands, and another brought him a bunch of feathers instead of a towel to dry them. Having feasted him of course, referring to himself, it's Captain Smith, having feasted him, after their best barbarous manner they could, a long consultation was held, but the conclusion was 2 great stones were brought forward before Powhatan. Then as many as could laid hands on him, dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and being ready with their clubs to beat out his brains. This is the first moment at which her name appears in any historical record. Being ready with their clubs to beat out his brains, Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms and laid her own upon his to save him from death. Whereat the emperor was contented he should live to make him hatchets and her bells, beads, and copper. Two days after, Powhatan, having disguised himself in the most fearfulest manner he could, caused Captain Smith to be brought forth to a great house in the woods, and there upon a mat by the fire to be left alone. Not long after, from behind a mat that divided the house, was made the most dolefulest noise he ever heard. Then Powhatan, more like a devil than a man, with some 200 more, as black as himself, came unto him, and told him now they were friends, and presently he should go to Jamestown and send him 2 great guns. By that, he's referring to 2 cannons. There were 4 cannons mounted at the Jamestown fort. Powhatan is requesting 2 of the cannons. Send him 2 great guns and a grindstone, for which he would give him the country of Pocahontas, now the land that Jamestown was already sitting on, would give him the country of Pocahontas, and forever esteem him as his son, Nantiquode. Forever esteem him as his son, Nantiquode. Have you guys seen the Disney movie? A couple of people are admitting, yes, they've seen the Disney movie. At the moment that encounter happened, John Smith was probably in his early 30s. All the best information we have is that Pocahontas was around age 8. So my question to you is, why?